Welcome to Tech with Kaushik. This is part 5 of our complete practice question series for the DVA-C02 AWS Certified Developer Associate exam. Choose your answer before the timer ends, then review the correct answer, explanation, and exam tip. Let us begin part 5. Question number 161. A developer is troubleshooting an application that uses Amazon DynamoDB in the US West 2 region. The application is deployed to an Amazon EC2 instance. The application requires read-only permissions to a table that is named cars. The EC2 instance has an attached IAM role that contains the following IAM policy. Version, October 17, 2012. Statement. SID, read-only API actions. Effect, allow. Action. DynamoDB, get item. DynamoDB. DynamoDB, scan. DynamoDB, query. DynamoDB, condition check item. Resource, ARN, AWS, DynamoDB, US, West, 2, account ID, table/cars. When the application tries to read from the cars table, an access denied error occurs. How can the developer resolve this error? Option A. Modify the IAM policy resource to be ARN, AWS, DynamoDB, US, West, 2, account ID, table/**. Option B. Modify the IAM policy to include the DynamoDB * action. Option C. Create a trust policy that specifies the EC2 service principal. Associate the role with the policy. Option D. Create a trust relationship between the role and DynamoDB.AmazonAWS.com. The correct answer is C. Create a trust policy that specifies the EC2 service principal. Associate the role with the policy. Here is why. The permissions policy already grants the required read-only DynamoDB actions on the cars table. The IAM role also needs a trust policy that allows the EC2 service principal, ec2.amazonaws.com, to assume the role and provide temporary credentials to the application through the instance profile. Why are the other options not correct? A. Expanding the resource to every DynamoDB table violates least privilege and does not fix a missing role trust relationship. B. Granting DynamoDB * provides unnecessary write and administrative permissions. D. DynamoDB does not assume the EC2 instance role. The trusted service principal must be EC2, not DynamoDB.AmazonAWS.com. Exam tip. A permissions policy defines what a role can do, a trust policy defines who or which AWS service can assume the role. Question number 162. A team defines Lambda functions with AWS CDK. Developers need repeatable local tests that run in a Lambda-like container environment, and the same tests must execute in CI before the CDK deployment. Which solution meets these requirements? Option A. Install AWS SAM CLI, generate representative events, and run automated tests with SAM local invoke both locally and in the CI workflow. Option B. Use a non-existent CDK local invoke command with documentation sample events. Option C. Use only a generic unit test framework that claims to reproduce the managed Lambda runtime. Option D. Build a container from a general node.js image without using Lambda runtime emulation. The correct answer is A. Install AWS SAM CLI, generate representative events, and run automated tests with SAM local invoke both locally and in the CI workflow. Here is why. SAM CLI uses Lambda-like container images for local invocation and can run the same scripted tests on developer systems and in CI before CDK deployment. Why are the other options not correct? B. CDK local invoke is not the required CDK command. C. A generic framework does not necessarily emulate the Lambda runtime environment. D. A standard node.js image lacks Lambda runtime emulation and integration behavior. Exam tip. Use SAM CLI local commands to test CDK synthesized or serverless Lambda workloads in Lambda-like containers. Question number 163. A developer has code that is stored in an Amazon S3 bucket. The code must be deployed as an AWS Lambda function across multiple accounts in the same AWS region as the S3 bucket. An AWS CloudFormation template that runs for each account will deploy the Lambda function. What is the most secure way to allow CloudFormation to access the Lambda code in the S3 bucket? Option A. Grant the CloudFormation service role the S3 list bucket and get object permissions. Add a bucket policy to Amazon S3 with the principle of AWS account numbers. Option B. Grant the CloudFormation service role the S3 get object permission. Add a bucket policy to Amazon S3 with the principle of asterisk. Option C. Use a service-based link to grant the Lambda function the S3 list bucket and get object permissions by explicitly adding the S3 bucket's account number in the resource. Option D. Use a service-based link to grant the Lambda function the S3 get object permission. Add a resource of asterisk to allow access to the S3 bucket. The correct answer is A. Grant the CloudFormation service role the S3 list bucket and get object permissions. Add a bucket policy to Amazon S3 with the principle of AWS account numbers. Here is why. Cross-account S3 access requires permission on both sides. The CloudFormation execution role must have S3 access, and the source bucket policy must trust the target account or role. Lambda deployment packages can reside in another account when in the same region. Why are the other options not correct? B. Using principle asterisk grants access far too broadly and is not the most secure approach. C. The Lambda execution role controls permissions used while the function runs. It does not grant CloudFormation permission to retrieve deployment code. D. It uses an unrestricted resource and incorrectly assigns deployment package access to the Lambda function. Exam tip. Cross-account access requires permissions on both the caller's IAM policy and the resource owner's bucket policy. Restrict access to specific ARNs. Question number 164. A Lambda function must read only a small set of confidential S3 objects. The application must use temporary credentials and follow least privilege. Which configuration is most secure? Option A. Store a long-term access key in Secrets Manager and retrieve it from the function. Option B. Attach an execution role to the function with S3 get object permission scope to the required object ARNs. Option C. Put a permanent access key in encrypted Lambda environment variables. Option D. Embed access keys in the function source code. The correct answer is B. Attach an execution role to the function with S3 get object permission scope to the required object ARNs. Here is why. Lambda automatically obtains temporary role credentials, and the scoped IAM policy grants only the required object access. Why are the other options not correct? A. A stored IAM user key is long-lived even when protected by Secrets Manager. C. Environment variable access keys remain long-term credentials and must be rotated. D. Hard-coded credentials are insecure and difficult to rotate. Exam tip. Give Lambda temporary credentials through its execution role and scope resource permissions to the exact required objects. Question number 165. An application encrypts data with the AWS Encryption SDK. The developer does not want to maintain a separate database that maps each ciphertext object to its data encryption key. How does the SDK support later decryption? Option A. It stores plaintext data keys in EC2 user data. Option B. It uploads all data keys to a dedicated S3 bucket. Option C. It requires the application to maintain every data key manually. Option D. It includes encrypted data keys in the encrypted message returned by the SDK. The correct answer is D. It includes encrypted data keys in the encrypted message returned by the SDK. Here is why. The AWS Encryption SDK uses envelope encryption and stores one or more encrypted data keys with the ciphertext message for later decryption. Why are the other options not correct? A. Plaintext data keys must not be stored in EC2 user data. B. The SDK does not require an S3 key repository. C. The application does not need a separate manual mapping of ciphertext to data key. Exam tip. AWS Encryption SDK messages contain encrypted data keys, not reusable plaintext keys. Question number 166. A new AWS workload needs to call one external API at a fixed time once per day. The company has no existing compute infrastructure and wants the smallest operational footprint. Which solution is most efficient? Option A. Use an event bridge schedule to invoke a Lambda function. Option B. Run a Kubernetes cron job on Amazon EKS. Option C. Submit a scheduled AWS batch job. Option D. Maintain an EC2 instance with a Linux cron tab entry. The correct answer is A. Use an event bridge schedule to invoke a Lambda function. Here is why. Lambda plus event bridge provides a fully managed, pay-per-use scheduled execution without persistent compute infrastructure. Why are the other options not correct? B. EKS requires cluster management for one daily call. C. AWS batch adds job definitions, queues, and compute orchestration. D. EC2 cron requires an always managed server. Exam tip. Use event bridge schedules with Lambda for lightweight recurring application tasks. Question number 167. A Lambda function creates its AWS SDK client once in module-level initialization rather than constructing the client inside the handler for every invocation. What is the primary performance benefit? Option A. It creates a separate SDK client for every request. Option B. It automatically provides different exception handling behavior. Option C. Warm execution environments can reuse the initialized SDK client across invocations. Option D. It changes only the visual style of the source code. The correct answer is C. Warm execution environments can reuse the initialized SDK client across invocations. Here is why. Lambda may reuse the execution environment, so module-level clients and connections avoid repeated initialization work on warm invocations. Why are the other options not correct? A. The pattern avoids creating a client for every invocation. B. Client location does not automatically change exception handling. D. The main benefit is runtime reuse, not source formatting. Exam tip. Initialize reusable SDK clients and connections outside the Lambda handler. Question number 168. A relational application uses Amazon RDS and needs an in-memory cache to reduce read latency. Cached data must support encryption and remain available when a cache node fails. Which service configuration meets the requirement? Option A. Amazon DynamoDB Accelerator. Option B. Amazon Elastic Cache for RED-ISS OSS configured with replication, failover, and encryption. Option C. Amazon CloudFront. Option D. A single-node Elastic Cache for Memcached cluster. The correct answer is B. Amazon Elastic Cache for RED-ISS OSS configured with replication, failover, and encryption. Here is why. Elastic Cache for RED-ISS OSS supports encryption in transit and at rest plus replication and automatic failover for a highly available RDS cache. Why are the other options not correct? A. DAX is a DynamoDB compatible cache, not an RDS cache. C. CloudFront caches HTTP content at edge locations rather than database query results. D. A single Memcached node does not provide the stated high availability. Exam tip. Use RED-ISS OSS or ValKey when an application cache requires encryption, replication, and failover. Question number 169. A REST API starts a step functions report workflow through a Lambda integration. Some reports take hours, so the API must acknowledge the request immediately instead of waiting for the Lambda result. The workflow later sends a completion email. Which API gateway integration change enables the immediate response? Option A, increase the API integration timeout to equal the Lambda timeout. Option B, set the Lambda event maximum age so API gateway invokes the function asynchronously. Option C. Add an exams target header with the static value async. Option D. Add the exams invocation type integration header with the static value event and redeploy the API stage. The correct answer is D. Add the exams invocation type integration header with the static value event and redeploy the API stage. Here is why. Invocation type event makes API gateway invoke Lambda asynchronously, allowing the API to acknowledge the request without waiting for report completion. Why are the other options not correct? A. A longer timeout keeps the client waiting and remains subject to API timeout limits. B. Event maximum age applies after asynchronous invocation, it does not select invocation type. C. Exams target does not configure Lambda asynchronous invocation. Exam tip. For an API gateway AWS integration, set exams invocation type to event to invoke Lambda asynchronously. Question number 170. Many Lambda functions use the same third-party dependencies. Security updates currently require rebuilding the dependency copy in every function package. Which approach centralizes and versions the shared dependencies with the least complexity? Option A. Publish the dependencies in a Lambda layer and attach the layer to each function. Option B. Upgrade each function runtime whenever a library changes. Option C. Store the dependencies in code commit and download them during every invocation. Option D. Configure a maintenance window for Lambda dependency updates. The correct answer is A. Publish the dependencies in a Lambda layer and attach the layer to each function. Here is why. A versioned layer centralizes shared libraries so functions can move to an updated dependency version without embedding another copy in each package. Why are the other options not correct? B. Runtime upgrades do not update arbitrary application libraries. C. Downloading dependencies from a repository at runtime adds complexity and latency. D. Lambda has no maintenance window feature that refreshes package dependencies. Exam tip. Use Lambda layers for shared, version dependencies across zip-based functions. Question number 171. A Lambda application contains hard-coded RDS for SQL Server credentials and hard-coded names. For a DynamoDB table, S3 bucket, and SNS topic. Database credentials must rotate automatically. All configuration values must be encrypted, reusable by other applications, and updatable without code changes. Which design has the least operational overhead? Option A. Put all values in Lambda environment variables and implement custom rotation with a scheduled function. Option B. Store database values in parameter store and write a custom scheduled rotation. Workflow. Store other names in S3. Option C. Store the RDS connection fields in a rotating secrets manager database secret and store the table, bucket, and topic names as parameter store secure string parameters. Option D. Store the rotating database secret in secrets manager but duplicate all non-secret resource names in each function's encrypted environment variables. The correct answer is C. Store the RDS connection fields in a rotating secrets manager database secret and store the table, bucket, and topic names as parameter store secure string parameters. Here is why. Secrets manager handles managed database credential rotation, while parameter store centrally encrypts reusable configuration that can change independently of code. Why are the other options not correct? A. It requires custom rotation and duplicates values in each function. B. Parameter store does not provide the required managed database credential rotation. D. Environment variables are tied to each function configuration and are less reusable. Exam tip. Separate rotating secrets from reusable configuration, secrets manager for credentials and parameter store for application parameters. Question number 172. A DynamoDB table receives millions of short-lived feed items each day. Every item can be Deleted after 48 hours, and the team wants to avoid scans, scheduled compute, and explicit delete requests. Which solution is most cost-effective? Option A. Scan the table hourly from EC2 and delete old items with batch write item. Option B. Store an expiration timestamp as a number in Unix epoch seconds and enable DynamoDB TTL on that attribute. Option C. Run a scheduled Fargate task every 5 minutes to scan and delete expired records. Option D. Create a GSI and run a Lambda cleanup function every minute. The correct answer is B. Store an expiration timestamp as a number in Unix epoch seconds and enable DynamoDB TTL on that attribute. Here is why. DynamoDB TTL removes expired items asynchronously without scans, scheduled compute, or write capacity-consuming application deletes. Why are the other options not correct? A. EC2 scans and deletes add compute and read/write costs. C. Fargate still requires repeated scans and explicit deletion. D. DynamoDB has no date type, and a scheduled GSI cleanup adds unnecessary infrastructure. Exam tip. DynamoDB TTL uses a number attribute containing expiration time in Unix epoch seconds. Question number 173. A developer accesses AWS code commit over SSH. The SSH keys configured to access AWS code commit are tied to a user with the following permissions. Version: October 17, 2012. Statement: eft. Allow. Action: code commit, batch get repositories. SATA commit, get asterisk. Code commit, list asterisk. Code commit, git pull. Lu. Reso. Asterisk. The developer needs to create/delete branches. Which specific AM permissions need to be added, based on the principle of least privilege? Option A. Code commit, create branch. Code commit, delete branch. Option B. Code commit, put asterisk. Option C. Code commit, update asterisk. Option D. Code commit asterisk. The correct answer is none of the listed options. Add code commit, git push. Here is why. The developer accesses code commit through SSH, which uses the git protocol. Creating a remote branch requires pushing that branch, and deleting a remote branch uses a command such as git push origin, delete branch name. Both operations require the IAM permission, code commit, git push. AWS explicitly states that code commit, create branch and code commit, delete branch apply to the console, AWS CLI, SDKs, and code commit API, not to Git protocol operations. Why are the other options not correct? A. Create branch and delete branch would be correct for code commit API, CLI, SDK, or console operations, but not for branch changes performed through SSH/Git. B. Code commit, put asterisk grants several unrelated API actions and does not include git push permission. C. Code commit, update asterisk does not authorize git pushes. D. Code commit asterisk would work but violates least privilege. Exam tip. For code commit git operations, use code commit, git pull and code commit, git push. Branch-specific API permissions do not control equivalent git commands. Question number 174. An EC2 application sends DynamoDB write requests through the REST API and occasionally receives provision throughput exceeded exception. The team wants the least costly code level mitigations before purchasing more capacity. Which two changes should the developer make? Choose two. Option A. Create a second table and divide every read and write between the tables. Option B. Add retries with exponential backoff for throttled requests. Option C. Increase the table's provisioned read and write capacity immediately. Option D. Add a DAX cluster to accelerate the write operations. E. Use an AWS SDK for DynamoDB so the application benefits from built-in retry behavior. The correct answer is B. Add retries with exponential backoff for throttled requests. E. Use an AWS SDK for DynamoDB so the application benefits from built-in retry behavior. Here is why. Backoff reduces repeated contention after throttling, and AWS SDK retry implementations provide supported retry handling for transient DynamoDB errors. Why are the other options not correct? A. Splitting application data across duplicate tables adds major complexity. C. More provisioned capacity increases recurring cost before code-level mitigation. D. DAX accelerates reads and does not increase table write capacity. Exam tip. Handle DynamoDB throttling with SDK retries and exponential backoff before adding capacity. Question number 175. A code build project exceeds the allowed combined size of its directly configured environment variable values. The team needs a managed key value store that code build can reference at build time. Which solution is recommended? Option A. Store the values in Amazon Cognito. Option B. Put an environment variable document in S3 and configure code build to import it natively. Option C. Store the values in AWS Systems Manager parameter store and reference the parameters from the build configuration. Option D. Add a locale export command to the build spec pre-build phase. The correct answer is C. Store the values in AWS Systems Manager parameter store and reference the parameters from the build configuration. Here is why. Code build supports parameter store-backed environment variables, moving values out of the project's directly configured variable payload. Why are the other options not correct? A. Cognito is an identity service, not a build configuration store. B. Code build does not natively import arbitrary S3 content as project environment variables. D. Locale configuration does not change the environment variable size limit. Exam tip. Reference parameter store or secrets manager values from code build instead of placing large or sensitive values directly in project settings. Question number 176. A photo application serves original images from S3 through CloudFront. Client's request. Hundreds of possible dimension and resolution combinations through query string values. The solution should create only requested variants and reuse each generated result to keep processing cost low. Which design best meets the requirement? Option A. Use Lambda at edge to generate a requested variant, return it, and save the generated object in S3 for future requests. Option B. Pre-generate every possible variant with S3 batch operations and use a dynamic origin that automatically understands device parameters. Option C. Pre-generate all variants and route requests only by headers through Lambda at edge. Option D. Generate each image on every request with Lambda at edge and rely only on a maximum CloudFront TTL. The correct answer is A. Use Lambda at edge to generate a requested variant, return it, and save the generated object in S3 for future requests. Here is why. On-demand transformation avoids pre-creating unused variants, and storing each result in S3 prevents repeated processing for later requests. Why are the other options not correct? B. Pre-creating every possible combination is expensive, and the described dynamic origin does not perform the required mapping automatically. C. It also generates all variants in advance and relies on headers instead of the supplied query values. D. CloudFront caching helps, but regeneration can recur after eviction or expiration because the transformed object is not persisted. Exam tip. For many image variants, generate on demand and persist the result so subsequent requests use cached or stored output. Question number 177. A trading service reads frequently accessed records from DynamoDB. Load testing shows that database reads do not meet the application's sub-millisecond latency target. The team wants a DynamoDB-compatible improvement with minimal application change. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Add retries with exponential backoff to every successful query. Option B. Copy the records to S3 and enable S3 transfer acceleration. Option C. Add DynamoDB accelerator to cache the frequently read items. Option D. Add local secondary indexes without changing the access pattern. The correct answer is C. Add DynamoDB accelerator to cache the frequently read items. Here is why. DAX is a DynamoDB-compatible in-memory cache designed to provide microsecond response times for cached reads with minimal application changes. Why are the other options not correct? A. Backoff handles throttling but does not reduce successful read latency. B. S3 transfer acceleration is for object transfers, not DynamoDB record lookup. D. An LSI supports another query pattern but does not provide sub-millisecond caching. Exam tip. Use DAX when a DynamoDB workload needs microsecond read latency for frequently accessed items. Question number 178. A Python application running on EC2 needs distributed request tracing to identify performance bottlenecks in its code and downstream calls. Which two actions enable the legacy AWS X-Ray SDK and daemon tracing pattern? Choose 2. Option A, install and run the X-Ray daemon on the EC2 instances. Option B, configure the application to write trace documents to /var/log/X-Ray. Option C, install only the CloudWatch agent. Option D, instrument the application with the AWS X-Ray SDK for Python. E, write JSON application logs to /var/log/CloudWatch. The correct answer is A, install and run the X-Ray daemon on the EC2 instances. D, instrument the application with the AWS X-Ray SDK for Python. Here is why. The SDK creates trace segments and sends them to the local daemon, which buffers and uploads the trace data to X-Ray. Why are the other options not correct? B, the SDK sends trace documents to the daemon endpoint, not to a log file. C, the CloudWatch agent collects logs and metrics but does not replace X-ray tracing. E, JSON logs are useful for logging but do not create distributed X-ray traces. Exam tip. The legacy EC2 X-ray pattern requires application instrumentation plus the local daemon. AWS recommends OpenTelemetry for new instrumentation. Question number 179. Several SNS-triggered Lambda functions write to the same Aurora database. Every function must retrieve one centrally managed, encrypted database connection string rather than maintaining separate copies in source code. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A, store long-term database credentials inside another encrypted RDS table. Option B, store the connection string as a parameter store secure string and grant the Lambda execution roles permission to retrieve it. Option C, duplicate the string in every function's encrypted environment variables. Option D, replace the connection string with IAM database authentication without storing any shared connection configuration. The correct answer is B, store the connection string as a parameter store secure string and grant the Lambda execution roles permission to retrieve it. Here is why. Secure string provides one centrally managed KMS encrypted value that all authorized functions can retrieve with temporary execution role credentials. Why are the other options not correct? A, a database table is not an appropriate secret or configuration store. C, environment variables create separate copies in each function configuration. D, IAM database authentication can replace passwords for supported connections but does not itself store the requested shared connection string. Exam tip. Use parameter store secure string for centrally managed encrypted configuration when managed secret rotation is not required. Question number 180. Clients receive HTTP 400 responses from an API gateway REST API. The developer needs request and execution details that reveal how API gateway processed the calls and why they failed. Which configuration should the developer enable? Option A, enable Cloud Trail Insights and assign a trail ARN to the API stage. Option B, send API logs to Data Firehose and configure CloudWatch logs as a Firehose destination. Option C, Enable API gateway execution logging and access logging for the stage and configure the CloudWatch logs destination. Option D. Enable X-ray only and assign a log group ARN as the tracing destination. The correct answer is C. Enable API gateway execution logging and access logging for the stage and configure the CloudWatch logs destination. Here is why. Execution logs show API processing details, while access logs record request, response, status, and context fields needed to diagnose HTTP 400 responses. Why are the other options not correct? A. CloudTrail Insights analyzes unusual API management activity, not client request execution. B. CloudWatch logs is not a data firehose delivery destination for API gateway logs. D. X-ray provides traces but does not replace API execution and access logs for detailed 400 analysis. Exam tip. Use API gateway execution logs for processing details and access logs for request level audit and status information. Question number 181. A REST API uses API gateway and Lambda. Clients repeatedly submit the same expensive search through a post method, and the team wants API gateway to return cached responses. Instead of invoking the backend for every identical request. Which configuration enables caching for this method? Option A. Store the most recent response in parameter store and retrieve it from Lambda. Option B. Enable the API gateway stage cache and create a method-level cache override for the post method. Option C. Store responses in the Lambda execution environment/TMP directory. Option D. Configure only the CloudFront default cache behavior without changing the allowed cached HTTP methods. The correct answer is B. Enable the API gateway stage cache and create a method-level cache override for the post method. Here is why. API gateway caches get by default, but a method-level stage override can enable caching for post responses when a stage cache cluster is provisioned. Why are the other options not correct? A. Parameter store is configuration storage, not an API response cache. C/TMP is isolated to one Lambda execution environment and is not a reliable shared cache. D. CloudFront does not cache post responses using its normal cache behaviors. Exam tip. API gateway stage caching defaults to GET, other methods require an explicit method-level caching override. Question number 182. A CloudFormation deployment creates an RDS database. The database administrator password must be generated during stack creation, stored securely, and rotated automatically with the least custom operational work. Which solution meets these requirements? Option A. Run a cron process on the application host to create and rotate the password. Option B. Define an AWS Secrets Manager secret that generates the password and configure secret rotation. Option C. Build a Lambda-backed custom resource that generates and rotates the password. Option D. Use a parameter store secure string resource as a native password generator and rotation service. The correct answer is B. Define an AWS Secrets Manager secret that generates the password and configure secret rotation. Here is why. Secrets Manager can generate and securely store the password, and its rotation workflow updates supported database credentials without custom scheduling infrastructure. Why are the other options not correct? A. A host cron process adds server management and custom rotation logic. C. A custom resource requires Lambda code and ongoing maintenance. D. Parameter store does not natively generate and rotate database passwords. Exam tip. Use Secrets Manager when CloudFormation must create and automatically rotate a database credential. Question number 183. A serverless application contains many Lambda functions defined in AWS SAM. The team wants automated validation while a small percentage of production traffic is routed to a newly published version before the remaining traffic is shifted. Which two SAM configurations provide the most operationally efficient solution? Choose two. Option A. Add event invoke config destinations for successful and failed asynchronous invocations. Option B. Run SAM CLI local commands from code deploy during production traffic shifting. Option C. Configure deployment preference in the SAM function resources to enable gradual deployments. Option D. Select linear 10% every 10 minutes and omit validation hooks. E. Select canary 10% 30 minutes and configure deployment lifecycle hooks to test the new version. The correct answer is C. Configure deployment preference in the SAM function resources to enable gradual deployments. E. Select canary 10% 30 minutes and configure deployment lifecycle hooks to test the new version. Here is why. SAM deployment preference creates the code deploy resources for traffic shifting, while the canary configuration sends 10% first and hooks validate the candidate before full rollout. Why are the other options not correct? A. Event invoke config routes asynchronous invocation outcomes and does not control release traffic. B. SAM local commands are not code deploy production validation actions. D. A linear rollout is not the requested small canary followed by full deployment, and it omits test hooks. Exam tip. SAM gradual lambda deployments use auto-publish alias and deployment preference. Hooks validate before or after traffic shifting. Question number 184. DynamoDB streams is enabled on a table, and a lambda execution role has the required stream reading permissions. However, table modifications still do not invoke the function. What additional configuration is required? Option A. Increase the lambda function timeout. Option B. Create a lambda event source mapping for the DynamoDB stream. Option C. Forward the stream records through an SNS topic. Option D. Change stream view type to new _and_old_ images regardless of the function's data needs. The correct answer is B. Create a lambda event source mapping for the DynamoDB stream. Here is why. The event source mapping pulls the DynamoDB stream and invokes the function with batches of stream records. Why are the other options not correct? A. Timeout affects processing duration after invocation. C. SNS is not required between DynamoDB streams and Lambda. D. Stream view type controls record contents but does not connect the stream to the function. Exam tip. Enabling a stream creates change records. A Lambda event source mapping is still required to consume them. Question number 185. An application runs as a container in an Amazon ECS service on AWS Fargate. Startup. Configuration must be supplied as environment variables to the container. Where should the developer define these values? Option A. In the service definition under entry point. Option B. In the task definitions container definition under environment. Option C. In the task definition under entry point. Option D. In the service definition under environment. The correct answer is B. In the task definitions container definition under environment. Here is why. ECS task definitions describe container runtime configuration, including the environment array passed to each container. Why are the other options not correct? A. Entry point overrides the executable rather than defining environment variables. C. It uses the wrong task definition property. D. ECS services control task scheduling and desired count, not the container environment array. Exam tip. Put container configurations such as image, ports, secrets, and environment variables in the ECS task definition. Question number 186. A CloudFormation stack contains both web resources and a development RDS database. A stack update accidentally replaced the database and destroyed data. The team must prevent future updates from modifying the database and must retain the database if the resource is removed from the stack. Which two controls meet these requirements? Choose two. Option A. Configure the database for multi-availability zone deployment. Option B. Apply a stack policy that denies updates to the database resource. Option C. Add deletion policy, retain to the database resource. Option D. Add deletion policy, retain to the stack itself. E. Replace the stack with a stack set. The correct answer is B. Apply a stack policy that denies updates to the database resource. C. Add deletion policy, retain to the database resource. Here is why. The stack policy blocks update actions against the database, while deletion policy retain preserves the physical database if CloudFormation removes the resource. Why are the other options not correct? A. Multi-availability zone improves availability but does not prevent replacement or deletion. D. Deletion policy is applied to resources, not the stack. E. Stack sets distribute stacks and do not protect one database from destructive updates. Exam tip. Use a stack policy to restrict updates and deletion policy retain to preserve a stateful resource when removed. Question number 187. Sensitive objects in S3 must be encrypted at rest. Auditors also need cloud trail records that identify when an AWS KMS key was used and which principal used it. Which S3 encryption option meets the requirement? Option A. Server-side encryption with Amazon S3 managed keys. Option B. Server-side encryption with customer-provided keys. Option C. Server-side encryption with AWS KMS keys. Option D. Server-side encryption with keys managed entirely outside AWS. The correct answer is C. Server-side encryption with AWS KMS keys. Here is why. SSE-KMS encrypts the objects with KMS keys, and Cloud Trail Record supported KMS API usage with the calling identity. Why are the other options not correct? A. SSES3 does not provide customer-visible KMS key use events. B. SSEC uses keys supplied and tracked by the client rather than AWS KMS. D. Self-managed keys do not produce the required AWS KMS audit trail. Exam tip. Choose SSE-KMS when S3 encryption must include KMS permissions and auditable key usage. Question number 188. A DynamoDB reviews table uses review ID as its partition key. The primary access pattern is to retrieve the 10 highest rated reviews for one product. Each item contains product ID and a numeric rating. Which index supports the fastest query operation for this access pattern? Option A. A GSI with product ID as the partition key and rating as the sort key. Option B. An LSI with review ID as the partition key and product ID as the sort key. Option C. A GSI with product ID as the partition key and review ID as the sort key. Option D. An LSI with product ID as the partition key and rating as the sort key. The correct answer is A. A GSI with product ID as the partition key and rating as the sort key. Here is why. The GSI groups all reviews for a product and orders them by rating, allowing a descending query with a limit of 10. Why are the other options not correct? B. The LSI keeps the high cardinality review ID partition key and cannot group product reviews. C. Review ID does not order results by rating. D. An LSI cannot replace the base table partition key with product ID. Exam tip. Model a DynamoDB index with the grouping attribute as partition key and the ranking attribute as sort key. Question number 189. A software vendor distributes private firmware files from S3 to authorized customers worldwide. The solution needs low latency delivery and inexpensive, time-limited control over each download. Which design best meets these requirements? Option A. Put API gateway and Lambda in the data path for every S3 download. Option B. Create one CloudFront distribution for every customer. Option C. Use CloudFront with signed URLs for the private S3 content. Option D. Run Lambda at edge for every request even though no custom edge logic is required. The correct answer is C. Use CloudFront with signed URLs for the private S3 content. Here is why. CloudFront provides global edge delivery, while signed URLs restrict access to authorized users for a configurable time. Why are the other options not correct? A. API Gateway and Lambda add request processing cost and complexity to large file delivery. B. One distribution per customer is operationally inefficient. D. Lambda at edge is unnecessary when signed URLs directly provide access control. Exam tip. Use CloudFront signed URLs for time-limited access to individual private files. Question number 190. A Lambda function is invoked asynchronously. An event still fails after Lambda completes its retry attempts, and the developer wants to preserve the failed event for later inspection. Which configuration should the developer use? Option A. Send failed asynchronous events to an SQS deadletter queue. Option B. Use AWS config to process the failed invocation. Option C. Inspect only Cloud Trail management events. Option D. Send the event to Amazon Simple Workflow Service. The correct answer is A. Send failed asynchronous events to an SQS deadletter queue. Here is why. A Lambda deadletter queue retains supported asynchronous events that remain unprocessed after Lambda finishes its retry attempts. Why are the other options not correct? B. AWS config evaluates resource configuration and does not retain failed events. C. Cloud Trail is an API audit service, not a failed event destination. D. Simple Workflow Service is not Lambda's native asynchronous failure destination. Exam tip. Use a DLQ or Lambda destinations to preserve asynchronous invocation failures for investigation. Question number 191. A mobile application allows guests to use a limited set of AWS resources without signing in. The application must provide temporary credentials with restricted permissions and must not create IAM users for each device. Which solution is most efficient? Option A. Generate credentials through AWS KMS and embed them in the application. Option B. Create an IAM user through Lambda whenever the application starts. Option C. Require an external identity provider even though authentication is optional. Option D. Configure a Cognito identity pool with unauthenticated identities mapped to a least privilege IAM role. The correct answer is D. Configure a Cognito identity pool with unauthenticated identities mapped to a least privilege IAM role. Here is why. Cognito identity pools can issue temporary AWS credentials to guest identities and map them to a restricted unauthenticated role. Why are the other options not correct? A. KMS manages cryptographic keys and does not create guest AWS identities. B. Creating IAM users per app user produces long-term identities and administrative overhead. C. The application explicitly does not require sign-in. Exam tip. Use Cognito identity pool unauthenticated roles when guest users need limited AWS resource access. Question number 192. A PostgreSQL workload is moving to AWS. The company wants a compatible managed database. An automatic rotation of encrypted database credentials without building a custom rotation system. Which solution meets the requirement? Option A. Use DynamoDB and place credentials in Secrets Manager. Option B. Use Aurora PostgreSQL and store the credentials in Secrets Manager with rotation enabled. Option C. Use Aurora PostgreSQL and configure native password rotation in Parameter Store. Option D. Use DynamoDB and configure credential rotation in Parameter Store. The correct answer is B. Use Aurora PostgreSQL and store the credentials in Secrets Manager with rotation enabled. Here is why. Aurora PostgreSQL preserves PostgreSQL compatibility, and Secrets Manager provides encrypted storage and managed database secret rotation. Why are the other options not correct? A. DynamoDB is not a PostgreSQL-compatible relational database. C. Parameter Store does not provide the stated managed database password rotation. D. It combines an incompatible database choice with the wrong rotation service. Exam tip. Pair supported relational databases with Secrets Manager when automatic credential rotation is required. Question number 193. A team uses a two-step AWS SAM deployment workflow. Before CloudFormation deployment, the developer must upload local artifacts to S3 and produce a transform template that contains S3 references. Which SAM CLI command performs that preparation? Option A, SAM package. Option B, DB create application env. Option C, SAM traces enable. Option D, lambda update function code. The correct answer is a SAM package. Here is why. SAM package uploads local artifacts to S3 and writes a deployable template whose code locations reference those uploaded artifacts. Why are the other options not correct? B. The EB command is for elastic beanstalk. C. X-ray tracing is unrelated to packaging. D. Updating one function does not package a SAM application. Exam tip. In a two-step SAM workflow, package prepares artifacts and deploy applies the stack. Question number 194. A central AWS CDK application deploys stacks across several accounts. During deployment, the application must run AWS SDK logic that identifies and deletes resources left behind by earlier stack versions. The solution should fit directly into the existing CDK codebase with minimal additional configuration. Which implementation best meets the requirement? Option: create an Amplify API that invokes the cleanup function during deployment. Option B: define a lambda-backed AWS CDK custom resource in the central CDK application. Option C: write the lambda function manually in the console and import it into every stack. Option D: generate a separate JSON CloudFormation template and manage the custom resource outside the CDK application. The correct answer is B. Define a lambda-backed AWS CDK custom resource in the central CDK application. Here is why. A CDK custom resource integrates deployment time SDK logic directly into the existing construct tree and invokes the provider during stack lifecycle events. Why are the other options not correct? A. Amplify is unrelated to CloudFormation lifecycle hooks. C. Console-created functions add manual configuration and imports across accounts. D. A separate JSON template duplicates infrastructure management outside the CDK workflow. Exam tip. Use a CDK custom resource when deployment needs imperative AWS SDK work that CloudFormation resources do not provide. Question number 195. An auto-scaling launch configuration is managed by CloudFormation. Its bootstrap process needs sensitive configuration, but the plaintext value must not appear in the template or be stored unencrypted. Which design is most secure and integrates directly with CloudFormation? Option A. Place the sensitive value in an unencrypted S3 object and download it at startup. Option B. Put the value in a CloudFormation parameter and attempt to encrypt the template file. Option C. Store the value as a parameter store secure string and use a CloudFormation dynamic reference. Option D. Store the value on EFS and enable encryption only after the file system is created. The correct answer is C. Store the value as a parameter store secure string and use a CloudFormation dynamic reference. Here is why. Secure string encrypts the sensitive value with KMS, and the dynamic reference lets CloudFormation resolve it without placing plaintext in the template. Why are the other options not correct? A. An ordinary S3 object does not provide the same direct secret reference pattern and may expose plaintext. B. CloudFormation templates themselves are not encrypted through a KMS template setting. D. EFS encryption must be enabled at creation and adds unnecessary file system infrastructure. Exam tip. Use CloudFormation dynamic references for values stored in parameter store secure string or secrets manager. Question number 196. An organization stores database passwords for RDS, Aurora, and Document DB workloads. Passwords must be encrypted and rotated automatically on a regular schedule. Which solution is the most secure? Option A, store encrypted credentials in S3 and rotate only the object's encryption key. Option B, store credentials as parameter, store secure string values and enable a non-existent native database password rotation feature. Option C, use IAM database authentication as one universal mechanism for every listed database engine. Option D, store the credentials in Secrets Manager and configure scheduled rotation by using the appropriate Secrets Manager rotation function templates. The correct answer is D, store the credentials in Secrets Manager and configure scheduled rotation by using the appropriate Secrets Manager rotation function templates. Here is why. Secrets Manager encrypts credentials and supports scheduled rotation workflows for supported RDS, Aurora, and Document DB database secrets. Why are the other options not correct? A, rotating an S3 encryption key does not change database passwords. B, parameter store has no native database secret rotation feature. C, IAM database authentication is not a universal replacement for credentials across every listed engine and configuration. Exam tip. Use Secrets Manager rotation templates or managed rotation strategies for supported database credentials. Question number 197. A Lambda function opens connections to an Aurora MySQL database. Under concurrent testing, the database returns too many connections. The developer wants to resolve connection exhaustion with minimal operational effort. Which solution should be implemented? Option A, place Amazon RDS proxy between Lambda and the database and connect through the proxy. Option B, convert the application and data model to DynamoDB. Option C, add a red replica without changing the connection management behavior. Option D, configure multi-availability zone and continue connecting directly. The correct answer is A, place Amazon RDS proxy between Lambda and the database and connect through the proxy. Here is why. RDS proxy pools and reuses connections across concurrent Lambda execution environments, reducing database connection exhaustion. Why are the other options not correct? B, migrating databases is a major redesign. C, a read replica does not pool Lambda connections and may not help write or transactional queries. D, multi-availability zone improves availability but does not manage connection counts. Exam tip. Use RDS proxy when bursty Lambda concurrency creates too many relational database connections. Question number 198. A SAM application defines an API gateway REST API backed by Lambda. Developers need a local HTTP endpoint that emulates the API so they can send test requests before deployment. Which SAM CLI subcommand should they run? Option A, SAM local invoke. Option B, SAM local start API. Option C, SAM local generate event. Option D, SAM local start Lambda. The correct answer is B, SAM local start API. Here is why. SAM local start API runs a local HTTP server that emulates API gateway routes and invokes the configured Lambda functions. Why are the other options not correct? A, SAM local invoke invokes one function directly rather than exposing API routes. C, generate event creates sample event payloads. D, start Lambda exposes a local Lambda invoke endpoint for SDK or CLI calls, not an API gateway REST endpoint. Exam tip. Use SAM local start API for local API requests and SAM local invoke for direct function tests. You have completed part 5 of the DVA-C02 practice series. Continue your preparation by opening the complete playlist and watching the remaining parts in sequence. Please like this video, subscribe to Tech with Kaushik, and enable notifications for more certification exam preparation content. Share your score, questions, or feedback in the comments. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.